So welcome. Thank you for coming to our presentation. And thank you, Patricia, for joining us and for working with us today. We really appreciate you coming and are really delighted that you're here and able to join us today. So I'm just going to introduce Patricia very quickly, and then she'll make a presentation. Ah, I did it again. I didn't introduce myself.
And yourself, yes, introduce yourself.
Yeah, I am Jackie Knight. I'm the Director of Continuing Education and Art New England, so of Massachusetts College of Art and Design. I just think it's a given. Everybody knows who I am. So now it's true. So let me introduce Patricia, and then Patricia will give a presentation, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So hold on to your questions. So as I said, I'm really delighted Patricia is here today. Patricia is an artist, curator, educator, and the founder of the artist-run organizations, the Crit Lab and Map Space, where she developed residencies in New York and in Italy. She's a founder of the Lace Archive, a historical and community archive of thousands of donated lace works and family histories. She's been awarded residencies at Constance Stultenstall Foundation, iPark, Ware Farm, Vermont Studio Center, many others, and has received grants from the Northern Manhattan Arts Alliance, 2 artist grants from Arts Westchester, New York City Council, an Anonymous Was a Woman COVID-19 relief grant, and was part of a year-long NEA grant working with homeless youth. She has developed education programs for K-12 museums and institutions, including Franklin Furnace, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, American Museum of Natural History, and the Smithsonian Institution. She's a noted expert, and this is the pertinent part for today especially. She's a noted expert on the history and use of natural dyes and pigments, and teaches about environmentally sustainable art practices. Miranda currently teaches studio art and professional practice in undergrad and grad programs at Montclair State University, New Jersey City University, and Massachusetts College of Art. And as faculty of Lyme Academy, she led the first study abroad program in Italy, Prato, Italy. And her work has been exhibited at Jane Street Art Center, Garrison Art Center, Hudson Valley, New York, ODETTA Gallery, Williamsburg Art and Historical Center, the Clemente Center, ABC, No Rio, and Wave Hill, New York City, and more. There's so much here that I didn't want to go through the whole thing, but as you can see, our guest today is very accomplished, and we're really delighted to have her here. Thank you, Patricia, for doing this, and we begin.
Okay, thanks so much. Hello to everyone. I'm really delighted to be here with Mass Art and with everyone here. Thank you, Jackie, for inviting me and to be a part of the Art New England programs in the summer for the first time. I haven't worked with the program before, so I'm super excited about it. I love to be able to dig into some intensive information and processes and everything else. So I'm going to talk a little bit just to give you an idea of how what I'm going to do tonight, as I'm going to talk about my current work, a couple of recent projects, and then I'm going to kind of work a little bit backwards so you can see a sort of trajectory for how this work relates to some of the ideas in the workshop and my thinking, how my thinking has evolved over time. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the specific ideas and processes that we will dig into in the workshop. So because it's an intensive, we can really get in deep, and people who know me know that that's sort of my specialty, is to dig deep and wide. So this is the image that you're all seeing, and just let me know if anybody can't see something or needs some more information clarified or anything like that. And I really do hope that we'll have time for some questions because I love a good discussion. This is an image from my recent solo exhibition at Jane Street Art Center in Saugerties, New York. It's large textile installation. All of these textiles are dyed with natural dyes. In particular, in this instance, cochineal insect dye, which is something we will sort of dig into a bit in the get my, oops. Sorry, get my cursor working here. Okay, this is just a entry into the exhibition to give you some sense of the space. This is the work that is connected to the Lace Archive, which is a historical and community program or project that came up during the pandemic when people saw me dyeing lace on my Instagram feed and started sending me lace. And I have since documented thousands of pieces of lace and have boxes and boxes and bags of lace still to be documented, and realized that this was a really important project and that this work really needed to be documented. So it's a much longer project than I'll go into now, but anybody who has lace, and if you have lace, you can send me, I can pay for shipping. And I document it, I keep track of, I am archiving who sent it. People are sending me these amazing stories about the lace and the lace makers. And then I create these installation pieces from the lace. So it's existing on multiple levels. This is a 36-foot long by about 10.5 feet tall. I guess you could call it a kind of a tapestry, but each piece of lace is dyed multiple times, dyed and dried multiple times with cochineal insect dye, and then hand sewn together into these large textile installations. I work with, and as mentioned, I'm interested in the sort of ecological footprint of objects. So I'm often thinking about how I can address a kind of ambition as an artist and ambition of the objects and still be accountable to a kind of ethical aesthetic in my work that wants to consider the ecological footprint of objects. And so the textile and the natural dyes allow me to do that. So just a few views of this exhibition. I've been working with natural dyes and pigments for over 25 years. And I think that I have a little bit of perhaps a slightly different sort of historical perspective or experience in working with them, in that my experience is rooted in dyes and pigments that have a long cultural history. This image here, I'll get back to that in 1 second. This image here has, often the pieces have these small ex votos, which is a tradition that you'll find all over the world, but of course has a particular lineage in the Christian tradition. People may know them as milagros or ex votos, originating in this particular form in Italy and traveling through the sort of Christian world. These were used as a kind of request. They would be created and then brought to a sacred place in request, in gratitude, in memoriam, and in devotion. So I've often incorporated those into my work. And so the pieces, so my sort of perspective with natural dyes and pigments is that I'm interested particularly in, I support, there's a huge eco dye movement going on now, which is amazing and incredible. My sort of perspective on it is that I work with dyes and pigments that have a particularly long cultural history. I'm interested in not only their material language, but also how they communicate their histories in trade, their histories in the lineages of art history, and materials that have been used for thousands of years. These materials often have very fascinating stories. I'm very interested as an artist in how the material itself communicates content. So it's not only a means to an end to make this, for example, beautiful red color, but also as an entire kind of visible history in the material itself. So in teaching, I'm always thinking about how the materials themselves communicate content. And I work a lot with artists in thinking through their work and how materiality is not incidental to their work. So it has that ethic might go all the way through, and those materials might communicate content. This is a piece that I'm just showing you some of these. So when I teach about materiality, I'm teaching about the kind of history of materials. I love to teach about materials in this very comprehensive way. So rather than we're going to learn about this one material, this one method, this one technique to use it, I want to give people a kind of comprehensive understanding of how materials function, how they interact, what are their histories, what are their scientific and aesthetic characteristics, their compatibilities, et cetera, et cetera. And that opens up an enormous range of possibilities for what you can do with materials. So this, for example, these are small panels that are done with graphite and rabbit skin glue and gold leaf. They're hand drawn these are all images from the LACE archive. So I get to, when you have an understanding, a sort of comprehensive understanding of materials and their functions and characteristics and uses, you can really experiment. You can be really, you can use that work, you can innovate that work in ways that's really connected to your own personal vision. That's sort of my commitment to artists is working with artists to kind of, investigate, discover, explore, and innovate their own vision. So these are some examples of an innovation of material techniques that I have a huge amount of facility with because I understand how materials function. And so I can experiment, I can push their envelopes quite a bit. This is another example. These are gilded on glass using a gelatin size. These glues that I'm talking about are all going to be covered in the workshop. This is the glass is gilded. Can't say that 3 times fast. And then in essence, creating a kind of a mirror. And then I actually hand draw. The graphite ones are done with a pointed stone burnisher, and the glass ones are done with a wooden stylus where I'm essentially removing gold to do the drawing. So they're all completely hand done. People often think they're printed, but they are hand done. And you can see that it is through removal of about probably 85% of the gold that you get this incredibly beautiful ghostly effect. And that's just where the light's hitting it just so you can see the gold. And that is a detail of one of the pieces. So in working with these kind of an expansive idea of materials and an expansive understanding of materials, one can extrapolate and experiment and create innovative new ways to express yourself. So this is just an image of my prior show at Garrison Art Center, where you can see the graphite pieces alongside the textile pieces throughout the exhibition. And again here, and the textiles again get, so one of the things I love about textile is its adaptability, its flexibility, its resilience, its strength. And I love to combine those things in different modalities. And so these are just some examples of how this work has been exhibited in different places. And an earlier project where I started to work with lace at iPark residency, where I dyed materials with dyes that were found on the land here. And also this is cochineal, which of course is not indigenous to the US, so it was not found here, but working with both indigenous, invasive, foraged and purchased dyes. I've done a lot of projects like that. I've also worked a lot with books. These are deaccessioned religious books that I'm dyeing the entire book with cochineal dye and threading them with pearls and stuff like that. So I'm very interested in how one can use a material itself, such as a book, such as the cochineal, as a communicative element in the work. So I wanted to just step back a few years to show you some work and talk a little bit about some work that is, again, a few years old, that is a little bit about the trajectory or the journey that I've taken with these natural dyes and pigments. I, again, have been working with these for many years. I have a sort of a deep area of research in the history of manuscript illumination, panel painting, the history of Western painting, basically the entire sort of trajectory from the Egyptians up through today in terms of both modalities and materials and techniques. So these paintings are egg tempera, so that's egg yolk and mineral pigment. They are paintings that when I was working with these, I'm thinking about the materials, I'm thinking about the colors and the paint as means to create an image in a sense, right? I'm still thinking about the way that materiality communicates, the way that an egg tempera painting would communicate very differently than an oil painting, for example. But I'm not quite at that point where I'm sort of allowing the materials to really, really dictate the direction. This is a series I did based on the patterns and images from illuminated manuscripts from the 3 Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because this is a familial relationship. And so these are imagery that are sort of inspired by and taken from those sources. And again, they're often quite large. They went up to about 4 by 6 feet. This one here is about 4 feet. And this one's a little bit smaller than that. And because I have this understanding of materials and understand that one works with a material, right? One moves into a material's nature and its characteristics. I gain through that an enormous amount of flexibility in what I can do with it. So people have told me that I'm doing things with egg tempera that nobody thought they could do. People tend to think of it as this very, particular and articulate and almost fussy medium, which of course it has that aspect. But I think when you understand a material and understand its parameters, you can really push it and experiment and get both very articulated detail as well as very loose detail. And I think this is true of all materials. When we understand the sort of characteristics and scientific qualities and all of that, compatibilities, et cetera, of a material, we can really experiment and innovate. So the egg temper paintings were important to me in this, again, this investigation of the traditions of manuscript illumination in the three Abrahamic faiths. And as I started working more and more with these materials, or as I continued to, because I'd been working with them for many years, the materials began to assert themselves much more, I think, much more upfront. And I began to make things that were allowed the cochineal or the indigo or the yellow ochre or whatever to kind of build the content itself. So I wanted to show you these paintings because they are, egg temper is this incredibly beautiful medium that if you sort of work into its characteristics and its properties can open up into lots of, into endless possibilities, I think. It has its own nature. Like, well, this is the thing about materials, is they have their own nature. And when one understands that one is not trying to make egg tempera look like oil paint, for example, one can move into the sort of ways that egg tempera can express itself that one can really expand on its nature. So this is what my studio often looks like these days. This is me dyeing lace. Again, these lace pieces are dyed multiple times, dyed and dried, dyed and dried. And being that I've been working with these materials so long and also taught painting methods for many, many years, which is an amazing thing in undergrad, because every semester I would have like 18 students who were like my lab experiments, right? We made all of the materials, all these ancient materials. We made egg tempera and glaire, and we made oil paint. We did all of these materials. We prepared all kinds of different surfaces. And so you really get to understand materials really well when you have that kind of laboratory. This is just an example of the quantity of cochineal that I am often working with. And this is not the exact video that I posted on Instagram in the early part of the pandemic, but something fairly close. And the color is just amazing. And I fell madly in love with it, of course. And just gives you a sense of the kinds of things that we would cover in the workshop. The focus in the workshop is as much, and then of course they're sewed into these large tapestry-like pieces. So I want to talk about the workshop and the kinds of things that happen in workshops that I do. One of the things that, because I've been teaching so long and teaching these materials so long, is I love to dig in with people about what it is that they're really interested in. The workshops, again, I always want to have a kind of an overview of what, of the material practices, material characteristics, the histories, because I think once you have an understanding of that, you can leave the workshop and not feel like, oh, I knew how to do this with this material, but now I don't know how to do that with this material. But if you understand materials comprehensively, you really can. So this is just an example, a sampling of the kind of materials that we work with. In this workshop, we're going to focus on paint, but again, there's so many overlaps in the kinds of materials that one might use that there's quite an experimental component to it. First and foremost is to understand the materials and then understand how one might work with them. So paint is basically made up of color source and binder. These are the two sort of main subject matters, right? That the main constituents of how one creates paint. So color sources, of course, this is the thing that we all get extremely excited about, although I get super excited about binders. So, so we're going to talk about color sources and go through that in some detail. We're going to talk about histories. I mean, I'm very interested in the lineages of these materials, the way that they formulated and influenced and carried an aesthetic throughout. This is obviously a cave painting. So you're talking about paintings that could be anywhere from, up to 40,000 years old, perhaps older for some of them. This is red clay and soot, clay and soot were the primary pigment components in these, what are in some ways somewhat crude frescoes because they're working on limestone. This was cutting edge technology for the time, right? Using stencils, possibly using straws, doing this amazing work. And we still use red clay. We still use this material today in our paint. And so the lineages of painting that we find ourselves enmeshed in today have direct line to Egyptian painting, to and in fact, what I always say is that the Egyptians were the coolest artists. They basically invented pretty much all of the art technologies that were used, that traveled up through Alexandrian Egypt, up through into Europe and throughout the world, the ones that we would recognize as sort of Western art history. So early Egyptian Fayum portraits were encaustic and egg tempera. They used egg tempera for Egyptian sarcophagi. This is a really important lineage to understand and to be fascinated by the way that these materials got used. And so I always love to talk about lineages, and I like to connect lineages with what's happening today, because all artwork is in a conversation with other artwork. There is no artwork that is not in conversation with other artwork. And so understanding these lineages, both past and present, I think is incredibly important for artists to really develop the best, the best work that they can make, to really live into the ambition of what's possible in their work. So there are inorganic pigments, which of course are your minerals, right? They are inorganic. And those are lots of amazing and beautiful colors. This is a list of some of the ones that we would talk about. We will not, just FYI, in the workshop use any lead, mercury, or arsenic pigments. Those are the three most toxic, and also were the brightest pigments before cadmiums were basically invented and developed in the 20th century. But we will talk about them and talk about their histories and the ways that they were used and all of that, because I think it's really important. And also it's just really fascinating. It's endlessly fascinating. I love this image of lapis, of course, which is now produced synthetically. It has been produced synthetically for quite a long time, although it's chemically exactly the same. It is not made from a stone. That tooth there, you might say, why is she showing us a tooth? Well, that is a tooth from an order of nuns who had a scriptorium, and they discovered lapis in the teeth of the nuns, in the skeletons. So that means that they were painting with lapis. They were probably making lapis, producing lapis, and they might have been licking their brush, or there may have been some other way that the lapis was getting into it. But there is evidence of this lapis being found in their teeth, which I just find endlessly fascinating. And that's a good story about women illuminators. So, which there were quite a few, which people don't think, but not all the scriptoriums were by men. Primarily, yes, but there were quite a few women illuminators. So you can see the lapis here. And of course, all of the lapis, I should have put more images of like Fra Angelica, all that incredible blue that we see all throughout Western art history is all lapis, one of the most expensive pigments to produce, which I will talk about in some depth. We have cinnabar and vermilion, which is mercuric sulfide, occurring naturally as cinnabar. It is produced synthetically as vermilion, which of course the alchemists discovered by trying to make gold, and was used as far back as Pompeii. They would have used earth pigments, and of course these minerals are mineral pigments, so they are earth pigments, and this is what would have been available to them. Again, people would use what was indigenous to where they lived, with some pretty extraordinary things that would be imported from abroad. This is orpiment, arsenic trisulfide, another pigment we will not use in the workshop, but we will talk about. And we'll also talk about substitutes for some of these materials, because again, I'm interested in the ecological impact of the objects that we make. I love orpiment because it is the primary yellow that was used in most of the early Celtic manuscripts, such as the Book of Kells. You might look at the Book of Kells and think that it's full of gold. It is not. It is filled with orpiment. It's an amazing color, as well as a bunch of other colors that we will talk about. There are the organic pigments, right? These are the plants, the roots, the nuts, the seeds, the leaves, all of the kind of organic pigments that are derived from plants, your other primary source, right? Your inorganic and your organic. We'll go through a whole bunch of these. We'll also talk quite a bit about the ways that these things function, what is their, what is their light fastness, what is useful to use, et cetera, et cetera. They knew this even in the Middle Ages. They knew that a flower color, this is woad, which some really good stories about woad, which I will save for the workshop, which is sort of a poor man's indigo, you might call it. In fact, in Utah, it's a difficult plant. It's an invasive plant, so it will kind of consume all the nutrients in your garden. So if you have woad, you're usually not very happy unless it's in a box, but it does make this gorgeous color. I did a program for the University of Utah, and we talked about woad, and they said, we are paying teenagers to go into the mountains and pull it out because it just kind of overtakes everything. But it has a really fascinating history in the way that it traveled around and was used by different communities, different cultures across the world. Of course, indigo is something that many, many people know, and it is not related to woad, although they create somewhat of a similar color. Indigo was known since ancient times. The Greeks used indigo. It is a family of plants that make this beautiful blue. It's actually the fermented dried leaves of the indigo plant, and of course was named because it was imported from India. A couple of the colors that we will probably definitely use in the workshop would be Brazilwood and black walnut. Unfortunately, it won't be good foraging time for black walnut yet in July, but if you do have a black walnut tree, it is really easy and beautiful to make walnut dye, walnut ink, or walnut paint. Buckthorn yellow is another one that I really love that I would definitely probably make in the workshop. Simple buckthorn, Rhamnus cathartica is the name. It is found around here. I don't know, I think it might be introduced to North America, but was very common in Europe. And then there are the insect dyes. These are really important, incredibly important dyes, because they're the only way to get this particular crimson red, or one of the few ways. Red is a very difficult color to make in nature. And so, of course, the insect dyes have these incredible histories. Kermes is one. This is the one that was known to the world before the Spanish came to the Americas. It was one of the few red dyes, and it is where we get the term crimson. And then, of course, when the Spanish came to the America, there was cochineal, which was indigenous and existed only in the Americas until the Spanish came and brought it back to Europe and hid for a long time, quite a long time, the source of this dye, which helped keep them a great power. And so I love to talk about cochineal. It's a passion of mine. And so these are really interesting conquest era images of cochineal production, which was used by the indigenous American communities as a dye, as a paint, and also as currency. And this is a beautiful picture of cochineal cultivation today. And of course, thinking about how it affected art making, right? Because in these paintings, the fabrics these women are wearing would have been dyed with cochineal. The paint that the artist is using would have been cochineal, among other things. So there's lots of ways these materials thread their way. I think of these materials in a way as witnesses through history, right? Cochineal is this witness that traveled around the world and revolutionized many aspects of color making, not just in Europe, but of course, particularly initially in Europe, because Kermes was a very difficult color to cultivate, and cochineal was a much more plentiful material to make, to create, to cultivate. And of course, it's in the carpets, and when you see and it's also in many foods. We've all eaten cochineal or put it on your face as lipstick or some kind of makeup, unless you are buying vegan or kosher makeup or foods, then you can't be sure. Now, Starbucks no longer uses cochineal in their foods because there was quite a controversy about it a few years back. Some of you may remember. Now they use beet juice and stuff like that, but cochineal is a really important material, and mostly now is growing in Peru, although it's indigenous to Mexico and Central and South America. So I could talk about cochineal for hours. My other great passion in the insect dye family is the oak galls, which are wasp nests, which can be found in lots and lots of places. Again, July will not be the time when you want to collect your oak galls because the wasps may still be using it. Well, they'll probably be out, but they were difficult to find. The best time is the fall. I always love to tell this story about Kinsey, who was the sex researcher in the 1950s. He actually started as an entomologist before he started studying human sexuality, and he donated the largest collection of oak galls to the Museum of Natural History, and also the largest known oak gall. I think my collection is way larger than this. If this is the entire collection, I don't know. But I have collected oak galls from all around the country, and in fact, other places of the world. I'm still working on that. I did get a grant to do a project collecting oak galls from around the country, and we will talk about the ways to find them and how they function, how they are used, et cetera, and how fascinating they are, that they are all, these are all different kinds of oak galls. The ones on the right are Italian, the rest are, well, I think I have a picture here. So these are all from the US, and they're incredibly diverse, except for the one on the top left, which is from Aleppo in Syria, which I had always gotten oak galls from Aleppo, but as soon as the war in Syria started, I'm not able to get those exact oak galls again. Not the ones in this picture. These are the ones that are from probably from the Aleppo region of Turkey, because that war obliterated that trade, I'm sure. So they're probably coming from the Aleppo region of Turkey. So trade still, affects the way that we have colors. So we're also in the workshop going to talk. So we'll talk about these sources, color sources, the breadth, the breadth of it and the depth of it, and the travel of it, the way that these materials traveled around the world. And then we'll talk about methods. I love this. These are Native American paint pots. They're iron oxide, which is a way that they would store the paint and use the paint. And that is some lapis and malachite and azurite there. So this is a picture of the last workshop I did at Jane Street. It was a much shorter workshop than this one. So we kind of did a bunch of sampler things. You can only get so deep in a short workshop, but it was super fun. A really enthusiastic and wonderful group of people. So processing a material to make a color, right, is very particular. To make a paint out of it, this is malachite, which would not be used as a dye, it would be used as a mineral, so pigment for painting. This is some oak gall, making lots and lots of oak gall. And I think I have, I do have a little video here of this is the actual recipe and process of making the oak gall dye. Now, oak gall is this fascinating history. It's one of the 2 most common inks used all throughout history. The Dead Sea Scrolls are written with an iron Gallic ink. The Declaration of Independence is written with an iron Gallic ink, and Hebrew Torah is still written with an iron Gallic ink. So it's an incredibly, incredibly important material. There are reasons why it was used in the West in certain ways and used differently in the East. I will talk all about that because I think oak gall and cochineal are 2 of my favorite rabbit holes, topics to kind of explore and research and talk about. So we have our plants, iris green. If we can get some iris flowers, we can make some iris green. This is a workshop I did. I don't know, this was before the pandemic, I think this one, but these are some sampling of different colors of cochineal that one can get, the range of colors. The yellow is not cochineal, that's a buckthorn, but using different mordants and different additives, one can shift the color from one end to the next. And here is a little video of just some cochineal, pretty simple recipe here using the mordant. It's a mordant dye, which I will talk about the difference between the different types of dye. And let's see, I'm making here just a couple of different colors. One by adding an acidic, right, lemon, to brighten the color, and one not. So we'll get either a sort of more bright crimsony color, and that's silk, which silk loves an insect dye because it's an animal fiber. So animal fibers love animal dyes. And then this, we don't have to watch this whole thing, but here, I'll push it forward a little bit. So I'm going to add alum to that, and you'll see how purpley it gets. See, that is the magenta. Can you see that? And then with the with the acidic, we get a much brighter, more orangey color. So with dyes, one can alter the color and shift the color. And this is, grossly oversimplifying, but basically one can shift and change the color by how one creates it. This was a really fun exercise at a workshop where we were making a lake, which is a chemical reaction. And, it's just a beautiful thing, a cochineal reaction. So, fun stuff like that happens because I always think, my motto is sort of, not that this happens every time, but my motto is sort of like, you want everything in a workshop to go wrong, right? Because everything goes right, you get home and things go wrong and you have absolutely no idea why or what to do, right? We want to kind of sort of be adaptable and understand the materials so that we can understand what's happening when something like this happens. That was a reaction between the the alum and the chalk in making a lake. And this is just a beautiful little vat of cochineal. And clearly you can see that it is one of my loves. This is a cornflower dye. We'll talk about the dyes. I think one of the things that you know, is something to always think about is the fugitive or light fastness of a dye. Cornflower is a very delicate dye. You're going to find flower dyes in books, right? Because books are closed, right? Whereas if you keep flower dyes are so sensitive that there's a very good chance that they will lose their color. And I've had people contact me and say, I'm doing this eco dyeing and how can I keep the color? And there are just some colors that are not going to be stable in the light, right? So understanding that. But if you understand the kind of parameters from light fast to fugitive, you can make decisions about how you might use one color versus the other. There are different parameters for painting than there are for textile, right? Because textile, we don't mind if something fades over time, right? We love the sort of way that a Persian carpet would fade over time because of those natural dyes. But on your painting, you really don't want that to happen. It's okay for, you know, a beautiful cloth, but it may not be okay for your paint. So understanding the parameters of this is important. So here we're doing a whole bunch of, we're dyeing both paper and small textiles to make sort of swatch books. We're using red clay. I think that's turmeric and cochineal. This is indigo. This is a project with fifth graders who just got so excited by the way that the indigo comes out green and then hits the oxygen and turns blue. And these are some of this is just the 2-hour workshop we did at Jane Street where people just had a lot of fun experimenting. I love that they were not sort of, that they were really just having a lot of fun experimenting with mixing the different materials and different colors in different ways. Again, a little bit more of recent workshops where we were particularly working with textile. That's cochineal, oak gall, and turmeric, probably and red clay. I think there might be some yellow clay there too. And also hope to talk about substrates, right? Like, well, how do you use these materials? What are the kind of surfaces that they can go on? What surfaces are not going to be compatible? You know, you can't use these materials on an acrylic gesso, right? You need to understand how the materials interact. Also hope that people will come out with a beautiful set of toned papers that they can then use. These are toned with red clay, yellow clay, indigo, cochineal probably, and oak gall. Again, just some more tests of experimenting with the materials to kind of see the different effects: buckthorn, cochineal, red earth, oak gall, and turmeric. And you'll see some things will work on paper fantastically well, and other things are much better on textile. You don't find very much turmeric in paintings. It's not very light fast, but it makes a gorgeous dye especially on something like silk, right? So these are just, again, some samplers talking about the different kinds of dyes. These are a wide range of colors that one can get with cochineal, from a really crimson, the color the British redcoats are dyed with crimson, with cochineal. I don't know if they still are, but they certainly were. To get that bright crimson color, though, requires a mordant that is not safe. It's a toxic mordant, so I don't really use that one, but we can get quite a range without using the tin, stannous chloride at all. So there's the different kinds of dyes: substantive, mordant dyes, and vat dyes. Indigo is a vat dye, to just give you an idea of the difference in the color on different kinds of material, right? On a silk, on a linen, on paper, different kinds of paper. Of course, there are the binders, and I'm almost getting close to the end. I hope that you'll have some questions. So how do we bind our paint? When we're talking about paint in particular, you're talking about the constituents being color and binder, right? So there are lots of different binders, and they are so fascinating because each one behaves a little bit differently. We are used to the ones that come in our prepared paints, but there are many different kinds that we can use, and they're still the same. The Egyptians used gum arabic in their paintings, and we're still using gum arabic today. So it's not like suddenly we don't have any access to these historical materials, but they're still in use. And so you will come away with a paint set, definitely watercolor, if not a couple of other ones, and learning how to use some of these other materials, not only how to make the color, but also how to process it into a paint. This was a workshop at a museum, so it's a little more ad hoc, but I've done programs where I have thousands of people coming at me making paint at the same time, which are super fun. And then this is a student of mine. I'm going to turn the sound off, but who always had a lot of trouble making the egg tempera. This is the preparing of the yolk for making the color. And I'm gonna fast forward on this, but it was just an exciting moment because every time she did it, she would break the yolk. So this was the time where she really was able to do it. And we are removing the white from the yolk in order to make the pure tempera, pure yolk tempera. We also make a tempera with the white of the egg, and that's called glare. That was used primarily in books. The yolk was used primarily on panels. I'll just jump here. So, okay, that's the part. That's the great stuff where you pick it up and you get just the yolk, and it's the most gorgeous thing because tempera is midway between a water-based and an oil-based paint. So it has some of the characteristics of both, and it's just incredible to work with. I absolutely adore egg tempera. And this is just a quick video of a little demo I did for an egg tempera class. You can see how gorgeous it is. It can get incredibly fine detail like that, as well as do these kinds of more sort of wash effects that you saw in the larger paintings too. But it's such a beautiful paint. It's creamy and delicious. And if you look at sort of early oil paintings, especially I don't know if anybody saw the Holbein show, or if you look at Flemish paintings around there, trust me, there's egg in that paint. Because oil paint can't do the things that tempera is doing. And so egg yolk is compatible with oil paint. It's an emulsion, so it can be mixed with oil paint. And they certainly did that quite a bit. Anyway, this was a Zoom class. So this was just a quick Zoom demo that really got me craving egg tempera again after not working with it for a few years. And so this is just the last more or less last slide here. This was a program, and these children are much older now, so I feel like it's okay to show this here, their faces here. But program at the Children's Museum of Manhattan, where we were making all of these colors in the museum. And this was this young child's face when she discovered that this material she was crushing up was actually a bug. So I love that. I love that act of discovery. I love to have people connect with the material world in really visceral and palpable ways. I think that's really powerful. I think we live very far from the means of production, from like the sources of our materials. And for me, as a city dweller, I feel like I've gained an incredible intimacy with the material world through these processes, through working with them so closely over many years. I know how something feels or how it smells. I mean, if you bake, that's what it's akin to, right? That's like a very quick overview, jumping around a little bit to, and I'm gonna just stop this and stop my share so I can see your faces more clearly. And so, yeah, thank you so much for listening to that little dance through some of the things that we would be doing in the workshop, and also just a little bit of background on my work. I really skipped around a bit, but I think it gives you a sense of a kind of trajectory that follows the materials and how materials communicate content and the ways that we can collaborate with them to make the work that we want to make. So I hope there are some questions, and yeah, anybody? I don't know, Brenna, do you want to field questions for me?
Yeah, there were, first of all, thank you so much. That was incredible. And I love how passionate you are about this subject. It's really contagious. So there were some questions that came in as you were talking.
Yeah.
So let's see. I think some you already answered, but how are these organic dyes fixed onto fabrics being water soluble?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably a little bit more than is possible to go into. There are different kinds of dyes, and there are different methods in which they get attached to the fabric, right? So there are dyes that will just stain something, right? We've all spilled something on your clothing, and it stained your clothing, and that would be something that could make a dye. But things like cochineal or oak gall are mordant dyes. Those require a mineral salt. They require a mordant, which means to bite, in order for them to bite to adhere to the fabric. And then there are vat dyes like indigo, which are not water soluble and there's a bunch of different ways to make indigo, but they need a material that will allow the oxygen molecules to access and to attach to the fabric. So it's a very complicated, I mean, what's so amazing is it's so much chemistry, and that, you know, human beings have been dyeing cloth for millennia, right? For several millennia. And yeah. So I see that someone uses a slotted spoon for their eggs. Yes, there are many ways. Some people roll it on a paper towel. I just love using my hands because I want to feel the material. But yes, there are other ways to do it for sure.
Sammy asked, can you describe some of the toxicity issues?
Yeah. So in the workshops, I focus, it depends on the workshop, obviously. Anytime I'm working with, you know, young people, or I'm in a museum or in an institutional setting or whatever, where I don't have control over it, I'm only using the materials that are not toxic, right? That are safe to use. I don't use any arsenic, mercury, or lead pigments in any of my workshops, even in a school setting where I had a lot of control. Those are very toxic, but I do talk about them because they are so important, right? In adult workshops, I do use cadmiums, but I have a very strict, you know, I have a very strict protocol for how these things are used. And I'm really, you know, I always do a small lecture, if you will, at the beginning of every class to talk about how to think through the safety of materials. I think that we have to think a little bit more comprehensively rather than like, this material is safe, this material is not safe. I reverse that and say, how am I going to ingest it? This is how I can think about how to protect myself. And this will give you a way to work with some materials that are like cadmiums, which are not 100% safe, right? But are also nowhere near as toxic as something like an arsenic or lead. So that's, I hope that's helpful, but I'm a pretty, you know, I was known for being very strict in my classes about how materials are used. And I feel like I want people to develop really good habits, right? Like we all fall from grace in your studio, right? You start with really organized and everything, and then you're deep in and everything's a mess, right? So if you start with like decent habits, when you get messy, you're going to fall to really terrible habits. So I feel like if you kind of set yourself up for super strict habits, then, you know, as you work, it becomes ingrained, and, you know, you can get loose with them, but you're not going to get yourself into an unsafe area. And you can also choose to not use the materials that are not safe. I will say in my textile installations and everything, my sort of mandate is that I want to be able to bury it safely. That's how I gauge what I'm going to do with it. Now with paintings, it's a little bit different because a painting is going to be on the wall. It's not going to be sort of, you know, the materials are not going to be accessed. And so, and I can talk about that in a lot more detail. Also the history of the way that cadmiums are now, which is very different, much safer than they were even like 40 years ago. So, you know, pigment manufacture is very sophisticated now, very, very sophisticated.
Can you please talk more about your use of graphite and gold leaf?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with gold leaf very, very much. I also have some, you know, environmental concerns. I work primarily now with either I have vintage leaf or leaf. I've got a bunch of inherited leaf because I'm conscious of the sort of. It's not that gold leaf is perfectly safe. It's the mining of it that is problematic. So I'm aware of these things. I think that the graphite rabbit skin glue method, I mean, I can tell you, I'm not sure which parts you want to know, but it's basically the graphite is heated with the rabbit skin glue. It's painted on in many layers. It's sanded, it's burnished with an agate stone, and then it is gilded with the gold leaf using the rabbit skin glue that's in the graphite, and then it is burnished again, and then I draw into it. And so it's a fairly arduous process, but it does result in this beautiful kind of ghostly effect. And I think that as artists, if we want a particular effect, we don't really mind how much work it is, right? That's and I'm sort of known for, if there's a hard way to do something, you know, I'll probably find it. But yeah.
Do the colors change if you try to heat set the natural dyes?
Yeah, I think that this again depends on the dye, right? Because if you're talking about dyes, like the difference between a mineral and a dye is a mineral is basically when you look at a mineral color under a microscope, you have lots of tiny little stones, right, in solution. If you look at a paint. With a dye, you are extracting the chemical material from the plant material. So there's not a bulk, there's not a, you know, it's not like if you examine it under a microscope, you will see particles, but they're microscopic. So a dye is a stain. A dye is something that is extracted from a plant or an insect and extracted through heat. So heat is always pretty much, I mean, you can do some dyeing without heat, but you'll always get a better effect by heating your material, extracting the dye from it. So I don't know if that answers the, so setting the dyes is really done in the dye process, right? Of heating, adding a mordant, whatever that might be.
Here's one about the workshop. Are they held inside?
Well, I think the mass art workshops are inside, right? Yeah. So we'll set up a kind of a lab, right? For there'll be an area for, you know, pigments, there'll be an area for dye, there'll be an area for paint making. I like to separate those things because I think it keeps things organized and clean and safe. Yeah, pokeberries are beautiful. I think that pokeberries are something that would have been, I'm sorry, I'm like jumping ahead here and looking right at the chat. Pokeberries have been used a lot. They're also not light fast, right? So they are fugitives. So that doesn't mean one can't use them, but one understands the kind of spectrum. Like insect dyes are, like all dyes are fugitive to some degree, with the exception of the synthetic dyes that are being processed today. But the insect dyes are very strong, right? They're not very fugitive. So as opposed to something like a berry or a flower, those are quite fugitive. So pokeberries are going to make a beautiful color and probably beautiful on cloth and certainly on ink. And there's a high chance that it will lose its color because it's not so light fast. So, and so someone said you've mentioned focusing on the ethical aesthetic of your work and how do you balance the environmental impact and an understanding of the current labor practices, human rights abuses associated with some pigments and materials. It's a really excellent question. I think that, you know, we live in a world where one cannot always, I think it depends on what materials you're talking about, right? What the impact is. In terms of natural dyes, the trade is so small, right? That the impact is going to be smaller. And yet there's still an impact. So I think that one has to think in particular about the materials that one is using, the places one is buying the materials from, right? Because there are places that will think more carefully about resources. You know, we have that like fair trade coffee or something like that. You can kind of investigate that stuff in your buying of things. And it is also one of the reasons why I tried to I use gold that has been already used, like either recycled or vintage, or I inherited some gold from a family member. So because that is a process that is quite arduous, like the gold itself is not toxic, but the mining is quite dangerous. So yeah, I think about it a lot. I think that we want to kind of create an accountability and a visibility for these processes and these materials, and also to figure out ways to use them as responsibly as possible. In fact, there's almost nothing that is perfectly sustainable, right? Everything requires some resource use. So I think I kind of think of everything. It's kind of like the light fast, right? Things are on a spectrum. I can make choices that I'm not going to use this particular material, or I'm going to reduce that particular material, or I'm going to find a more ethical source for that material. So it's not a simple answer because the means of production in our world today are very complex, right? They're very complex. So there are people cultivating dyes and stuff in this country that you can be in touch with and find the materials, you know what I mean? Like directly from the source. And there are places actually in Peru who are doing that with cochineal. There are places that in India that are doing that with natural dyes. So yeah, I think it's really important. And I'm always, you know, I always say, hold me accountable. You know what I mean? That's okay with me. I want to have that conversation, and I'm very transparent about it. It doesn't mean that everything I do is, I had to make, in this last show, I had to make one compromise in the sculpture. I had to use a little bit of PVC pipe. I have since figured out a way to not have to do that, but you know, it is a real challenge. It is a real challenge. Yeah. It's a great question. I love it. I love to have those conversations. I mean, when I'm teaching in schools, we're using animal products, right? I'm using a rabbit skin glue, or we're using an animal skin or something like that. I know we're running out of time, but I will end up having these really incredible conversations with sometimes very young children who are uncomfortable. They want to think about it. And we sit down and I don't say, oh, this is, you know, don't use this or use this. we sit down and we talk about, well, what is our relationship to the natural world? What is our relationship to animals? How can we be accountable as citizens to make choices about the kinds of relationships we want to have, right? And so that might not mean that you are a vegetarian, but it might mean that you source your materials from an ethical place. So I think that these are, I'm not a fundamentalist. I think that we have to, but I think that those conversations are really, really important.
As you said, Patricia, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for your questions. I see that we're coming to the end of the evening. So I know there are a couple of things here that you didn't get to.
Yeah, the pink frosting, yes, like red velvet cake is generally cochineal. I'm just catching a couple of things, but if people feel like they are interested in, they have other questions, then feel free to reach out to me, questions about the workshop and how we might cover it. And I love when people will bring this to the room, right? Like bring it to the workshop, say, I want to try these materials, bring a material that you found. Does it work? Can we talk about its lineages? Can we experiment in this way? Have questions. I think that's great. I'm very interested in learning as much as, as teaching. So.
Okay, well, thank you. And we really appreciate you being here tonight and everyone who came and asked questions and just, participated just by your presence. So we appreciate it and hope to see you at one of our workshops. So
Thank you so much. Thanks so much
you
for listening and for your time and for the great questions.
Thanks.
Ciao, ciao.